It is Wednesday, September 13th, 2017. I almost said 2013. This is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, which is coming to you through Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, and that's me, Kenneth Arthur. But if this is going to be 3000 NFL Mock Draft as you remembered it from the last few years, because I have already put out Seaside Chats this week. You can listen to that one on iTunes if you haven't already. Comedian Nick Thune, Seattle native, came on to talk about his relationship with the Seahawks in Seattle. You can check out Nick in Bellevue at the Parlor this weekend. He's got 5 shows going on, so go check that out. And Jake Regal, a comedian in LA, came on and talked about the 49ers. But today, myself and as always, Rob Staten are here to talk about college football, the week in, and as well as how it leads into the 2018 NFL draft. And then we're going to talk about the Seattle Seahawks and the state of the NFL and sort of the direction the Seahawks could go in the draft, and as well as how they're going to develop those rootin' tootin' stinkers on the offensive line. So that's what we'll be getting into today. And as usual, we will start with college football. And there were games. Things happened. We got new games coming up, and we're starting to get just a hair of data on some of these players after 2 games in. For the most part, everyone has played 2 games, and we it's so early, but at the same time, there's got to be things to take away from it. And Rob, this week Clemson took on Auburn, and Clemson won 14-6. I know that this was a game of note for numerous reasons. So what did you see in Clemson, ranked number 3 going into the game against number 13 Auburn? What did you see out of this game between Clemson and Auburn, and what does it mean for the upcoming months?
Well, I think the big thing that sort of struck me with this game is it kind of encapsulated the issue that the NFL is facing and that college football is facing at the moment, and it's quite topical because it relates to the Seahawks as well and the play of the offensive line. If people didn't see this game between Auburn and Clemson, it was played in Clemson. Clemson had 11 sacks in the game. They absolutely dominated up front. Auburn had a couple of decent drives early on, put 6 points on the board, didn't score again in the game. They couldn't run the ball, they couldn't throw for anything. They had 74 passing yards in the game, had a very similar amount of running yards from Cameron Petway, who's this fantastic running back, but just had to fight for every single yard because the offensive line was so bad. If people aren't aware of Auburn's offensive line, it actually contains an All-American called Braden Smith, who plays a bit of right guard, plays a bit of right tackle as well. He's been touted by some as, one of the top 3 offensive linemen in college football at the moment and could be a first-round pick next year. Even despite having him on their offensive line, they had absolutely no answer to Clemson, who have, people think of a Darbo Sweeney team and they think of, quarterbacks, big name quarterbacks. They think of really great receivers who go in the first round. They've had plenty of those over the years, and these sort of high octane dynamic passing offenses. Well, Clemson have actually turned into more of a defensive team this year. The strength of Clemson is in the defensive line and the depth and the rotation that they have and the quality that they have in there. Christian Wilkins, for example, could easily be a top 15 pick next year as kind of like an interior pass rusher. He had 2 sacks in the game. He was absorbing, 2 blockers at a time, dominated. Dexter Lawrence, who's going to be a high pick in 2019, had a really great game. Clelin Ferrell, who's an edge rusher, who kind of looked a bit like Shaq Lawson, who was a first-round pick from Clemson the year before this one, just constantly working off the edge. Austin Bryant had 4 sacks in the game, and there was just no hope. I mean, they just couldn't do anything. If you think that the Seahawks against the Packers struggled to move the ball, struggled to give their quarterback time, then go and watch the Auburn-Clemson game because it was on a different level. And this is the issue, is that, Kenny, I could run a list of 5 or 6 names for you right now of players who play defensive line who could easily go in the top 15 of the draft next year. We already know players to kind of keep an eye on and to look for. We know who are going to be really good. I couldn't tell you an offensive lineman right now who I think is projecting to go in the top 15. You could throw names out there. Of course you could. You could say someone like Trey Adams at Washington, but then he didn't have a great start against Rutgers. You could talk about the guy at Notre Dame, Mike McGlinchey, who was responsible actually for Notre Dame not having a chance to win a game against Georgia at the weekend, giving up a big sack. Texas' Connor Williams has not had a good start. And this is the issue. When Seahawks fans kind of look at the state of their team's offensive line, And they wonder why the Seahawks aren't developing guys. And they wonder why, despite all of these picks, players are coming in and they're not performing. And they don't know why they aren't finding these gems in college football. It's because they really don't exist. You know, we've been over this so many times that the best athletes in high school look at the defensive line and they want to play that position for a number of reasons. One, they'd rather be the guy who has 10, 15 sacks to his name and can use that statistic as it's kind of fun. You want stats. You don't get stats as a left tackle. You get stats as a defensive end or as a defensive tackle. It's more fun to be going and attacking the quarterback than it is trying to protect the quarterback. And then when they get to the NFL, if they get that far, the money involved is much higher. And I know there's been this little explosion in offensive line pay in recent years, but you know, the best defensive linemen in free agency were getting sort of $10, $11 million a year. The best defensive linemen are getting, you know, maybe upwards of like $18 million a year in the future. So there's a real discrepancy there. You're seeing it in college football. It's leaking through into the league. I know that we look at Dallas and Oakland and Tennessee and say, why can't not just the Seahawks, but why can't my team have an offensive line like that? And the reality is there are a lot more teams with offensive lines like the Seahawks than people maybe realize. And this is part of the issue. There just aren't that many good offensive linemen in college football. And when they do go to the next level, they have to start from scratch. They have to just forget everything they were taught in college. They have to be taught everything again. A lot of these guys are projects, whether you take them in the first, second, the third round, or they're an undrafted free agent basketball player. They are projects. Mm-hmm. And this is what so many teams are having to go through. The Seahawks are not alone.
Yeah, and just to talk about some of those contracts that you're talking about in terms of making money as an offensive lineman, because it does, you know, seem like a lot of money, but let's break down. Let me break down some of the offensive line contracts that are out there now. The biggest total contract for any offensive lineman belongs to Tyron Smith of the Dallas Cowboys, $97.6 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but spread out over, it looks like 8 years. That's $12.2 million per year. Tyron Smith, you know, arguably at this path will be a Hall of Famer. Joe Thomas, definitely a Hall of Famer, $80.5 million, but just $11.5 million a year. Average guarantee per year, 1.4, only a $10 million guarantee for Joe Thomas, just $1.4 million per year. Trent Williams, a potential Hall of Famer at this path with the Redskins, $66 million, the third largest contract, $13.2 million. And it goes on like that for the handful of players good enough to get paid in offensive line free agency. But then what you do get is the overpaid offensive lineman like Riley Reif of the Vikings, $58 million. Russell Okung, who we know has the highest average annual salary of any offensive lineman in the NFL with the Chargers, $53 million, $13.25 million per year. You know, and a bargain is Kelechi Osemele of the Raiders, who comes in at $58.5 million, $11.7 million overall. But if you change per year, but if you change that to 4-3 defensive ends, you don't get anyone. You get a lot of these contracts, but then that are within that similar range of offensive linemen, like Cameron Jordan, $55 million, $11 million per year. But then if you get Jason Pierre-Paul, who, you know, already had an injury where he missed a finger and a half, he comes in and he's got $62 million, $15.5 million per year. Everson Griffin of the Vikings, $14.5 million per year, and not even a guy that a lot of people, the casual fan, even recognizes as an elite defensive end. Olivier Vernon, who is not, you know, at this point a Hall of Famer or even close to it, $85 million, $17 million per year. So I think it's easier, and $40 million guaranteed. Remember, Joe Thomas, $10 million. Zeke, a lot of these guys are getting, you know, much better guarantees, much more guaranteed per year on the contracts that they sign. Now that could change, and that's just 4-3 defensive ends. We haven't even gone over like a 3-4 outside linebacker. If you're a big guy and you know, if you can lean out like a, you know, a Von Miller, $19 million, Justin Houston, $16 million, Chandler Jones, $16.5 million, Melvin Ingram, $16 million, that you can see that if you're the type of guy that disrupts the quarterback rather than protects the quarterback, then you can get a lot more money. But at the same time, you know, these things could shift. And if the premium is, well, we can't find a good offensive lineman very often, I don't know, maybe, Rob, do you think maybe that there are college or high school coaches out there that convince these guys, look, if you go out there and you choose defensive end, yes, you may get the sacks. Yes, you may get, more opportunity and fame. But if you're the one offensive lineman in the NFL that is like a left tackle who knows what he's doing, if you're the one in college football, it can make you the number one overall pick. Do you see something like that happening, maybe where there's more of a push for these guys to go back to offensive line?
I don't. And the reason why is because when these colleges go out and recruit and they speak to 5-star and 4-star prospects, if they're saying, look, I want to play defensive line, and if you won't play me a defensive line, then, there's this other school in state or, wherever, who is maybe a rival in a conference who's willing to play me there, then you run the risk of losing out on these guys. Essentially, the colleges, their prerogative is to collect as much of the talent available as they can and then work it out from there. Now, what we might see is, for example, Cam Irving, who was a first-round pick for the Cleveland Browns, didn't work out, and they recently traded him for basically a sack of footballs. He was a defensive lineman, recruited as a defensive lineman, big recruit, and then they actually converted him back to left tackle, and then he ended up acting as a center for Cleveland. So he converted back from defensive line to offensive line. And we may well see this, if there are defensive, highly athletic defensive linemen who are buried on a depth chart, who don't necessarily want to transfer and are given the opportunity to play the offensive line instead of the defensive line. I think we will see a lot of that. But the thing is that the teams can just collect these defensive linemen, because on offense, what are colleges playing these days, Kenny? They're playing the spread, rather than sort of make a concerted push to put together a really strong offensive line in college. Teams are just sort of spreading the ball out, getting the ball out quickly, using very gimmicky offenses, fast-paced, up-tempo, to try and mask the fact that maybe there is this discrepancy between offensive line and defensive line in college. There's no real pressure on college teams to try and rectify this situation, because they can get by with 5 guys standing in the way on the offensive line. The best way to win is to have the loaded rotation on the D line that, for example, Alabama do it better than everybody else. Some of their defensive linemen, some of their best defensive linemen play like 15%, 20% of the snaps, because they can keep them fresh, because they've just got loaded of talent, just these guys kind of cycling in. And because they've got the reputation, 5-star recruits will go and play for Nick Saban and accept that situation because they're playing for Alabama and they see the number of high picks and the success and the being able to win championships and stuff like that. So I don't see this changing anytime soon, but teams have got to be creative. They've got to find ways around this. The Seahawks have gone down a certain route with this to try and find a way of dealing with this issue, and it's meant a lot of picks. It's meant taking a lot of chances on high upside players. It's meant sort of relying on the offensive line coach to try and coach these guys up. I'm sure we'll come on to sort of Tom Cable and the offensive line a little bit later on. So, I do think that it's quite a lazy argument just to point the finger at him and say, isn't it about time you put together even an average offensive line? I don't think anybody would argue that the offensive line should be better in Seattle or can do better or didn't perform very well on Sunday. Nobody's going to make that argument. But this is about more than just one man being unable to put an effective offensive line on the field. It's about so much more than that. There's so many layers to this conversation and to this reason why the Seahawks don't have a particularly good offensive line at the moment. And it's not just because Tom Cable isn't doing a good enough job. It's a much broader conversation than that.
Last week you talked about Lamar Jackson. This week and you just this week talked about Clemson getting 11 sacks last week in their game against Auburn. Okay, now that I've stumbled through the introduction, and a year ago, Louisville was ranked 3rd overall. They went to Clemson, who was ranked 5th overall. Louisville lost the game, but Lamar Jackson went on to win the Heisman Trophy. Clemson was ranked below Louisville at the time, but went on to win the national championship. They had Deshaun Watson, who, of course, went on to be a first-round pick of the Houston Texans. It was a thrilling 42-36 game in favor of the Clemson Tigers after they went up 28-10, and then Louisville came back with a 16-point third quarter. Very good game, and so we're getting a rematch of that this week with Louisville ranked 14th and Clemson ranked 3rd. It could turn either way for either one of these games. Either one of these teams that wins the game is going to have that much more of an advantage going through the season as they try to get a national championship. Lamar Jackson, 6 touchdowns last week, 3 through the air, 3 on the ground. Still the best player in college football. One of the most exciting players we've seen in college football ever. And Clemson going through the transition without Deshaun Watson is not, struggling by any means at all. They sacked Lamar Jackson 5 times last year. You talked about the 11 sacks. They had 5 sacks against Lamar Jackson last year. What do you expect this week between Clemson and Louisville?
It's a fascinating game. It's a game that I cannot wait to watch because Clemson don't have the offensive chops that they've had in the past. So them keeping up with Louisville is going to be harder than it was a year ago. And that was kind of what happened. Louisville at one point really looked like they were going to go and win the game against Clemson. And then Clemson gradually sort of ground the way back into it. But they haven't got sort of the staying power on offense anymore. So it's going to really come down to whether that defensive line can get to Lamar Jackson and kind of do what they did to Auburn last week. I think Louisville overall are, I think as a cumulative roster, are weaker than they were a year ago. But Lamar Jackson's better than he was a year ago, so it kind of balances it out. He's playing tremendous football at the moment. It's all about him for me, this game. I mean, the Clemson defensive linemen are going to have a great year. They're going to put up massive stats. People like Christian Wilkins are going to go very early in the draft. Clelin Ferrell and people like that are going to go early in the draft. That's not a question mark. I think the most interesting thing about this is to see just how good Lamar Jackson is. Right now, I think that there's only probably Sam Darnold who is better than he is in terms of draft stock. And I could easily imagine a situation where Lamar Jackson either overtakes Sam Darnold or is still going to go very high in the draft. Just the way that he's playing, the way that he's diagnosing the passing game, the way that he's staying patient in the pocket and he's just not taking off and running, the way that he's showing a lot more touch in the passing game, some of the throws that he's making. He had this incredible throw against North Carolina last weekend where he sort of scrambled away from pressure, kept his eyes downfield, just launched a bomb downfield to the receiver who had, and he had to throw this, about 50, 60 yards. Dropped it into a bucket with 2 defenders in the vicinity, just on a plate for the receiver who catches it in stride, scores a major touchdown. And it's that kind of play that, scouts and coaches will constantly turn to in the offseason and say, this is what we're drafting. I just think he's an incredible player. I think there's just so much potential there, so much playmaking quality and brilliance for him not to be a legitimate first-round prospect. And I think if he beats Clemson this week, looking at the rest of their schedule, it's hard to imagine him not having another Heisman year. There's a lot of good players who will contest that. People like Saquon Barkley, for example, are going to be in the mix. But I think Lamar Jackson is, who the heck is going to stop him winning a second Heisman? I mean, he's just an incredible player and he deserves a lot more attention than his game.
I want to move to some of some more individual players around the country that could be ones to watch throughout the season and maybe into the draft next year. And Rob, if you have thoughts on them, great. We can use that to move forward. And if you don't, well, then I guess we'll all together watch these players moving forward if necessary. I'm looking at PFF, Pro Football Focus's college Twitter, where they've tweeted out their teams of the week for offense and defense around the nation. Of course, Lamar Jackson is the quarterback for the national team of the week on offense. And moving into some of the skill players, you've got Chris Warren III at Texas, who had 16 carries for 166 yards and 2 touchdowns this week for Texas. And Texas is traveling to USC this weekend, which should be an interesting game in the fact that it is that rematch of that historically significant national championship with Vince Young. I think the first time they've played since then. So that's interesting. David Montgomery of Iowa State is the other running back. Receivers are Deontay Burnett of USC, Tyler Brady of Michigan State, TJ Roming of Duke, and Will Dissly of Washington, which is the tight end, which is close to a lot of Seahawks fans. So between these skilled players, any thoughts on any of these guys?
Yeah, I mean the Texas running back. I don't know if you've seen him, Kenny. He's an absolute beast. I mean he's enormous. I mean he's kind of that. I don't think he's quite the athlete, but he's kind of like that Derrick Henry type of frame and build. So, not someone that I've spent an awful lot of time watching specifically, but he's he's a fun player to watch in that he's just enormous. You know, you're talking like a 250-pound running back here. So, perhaps a player who he's obviously replacing Donta Foreman there. Someone who may be worth keeping an eye on because Texas generally have been able to supply running backs to the NFL. I think that the Washington tight ends are very easy player to like. You know, I've seen him make a fair few plays. I think that it's good to see them sort of balancing their offense with a tight end as well. And although you often with these tight ends, you kind of want to see the physical profile before you make a complete assessment, because it's a position where, you know, that extra bit of surprising speed or athleticism can make a big difference. I mean, look at Kittle at San Francisco, had a fantastic athletic profile from Iowa, was, I think, taken as a fourth round pick, I want to say, by San Francisco, and is going to be their starting tight end for this season. And it's, you know, it is a big deal. You know, being really athletic at that position can be a difference maker. So you kind of want to see that before you make a full assessment on players like that. But from what I've seen of him so far, he looks pretty impressive.
Moving on to the defense, they've highlighted Darius Phillips, a cornerback, redshirt senior at Wyoming, but Wyoming this week playing Gardner-Webb Bulldogs. So I don't know exactly how much to take away from that.
Tough contest for Wyoming, that, yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, something I guess maybe to consider. You know, Wyoming does have some players of note, but there are two players that I am very interested in seeing some more of, especially because I did go to Washington State. But for the Cougs, two of them made the national team of the week on defense. Defensive lineman Hercules Mataafa and linebacker Peyton Pellieur. I should say it right, but I can't do it. So, Rob, as far as Washington State goes, I mean, they were down in the fourth quarter by 21 points to Boise State. They come back and tie it. They force overtime. They go to triple overtime and beat Boise State. They drop in the rankings from 20 to 21, which is fine because they really were close to losing that game and falling out of the top 25. They play Oregon State. They host Oregon State this weekend, and I certainly hope that they can come with a better performance. Luke Falk leaving the game, getting replaced by Tyler Helinski. Some interesting players still for Washington State, James Williams, and they're still in it for now, and for the first time, maybe putting in some NFL draft prospects, question mark. What do you think of Mataafa, Pellier, or anyone else perhaps on Washington State right now after two games?
Well, I actually quite want to. I'm not. They showed the Boise State Washington State game on British TV over here, and it was on about 3:00 in the morning. So I didn't watch it. I didn't stay up to watch that one. I have it saved in my system. Unfortunately, on the Sunday, my son decided that Paw Patrol was going to take precedence on the TV. So I haven't actually had a chance to watch that game yet. But Mataafa was definitely a player that I was going to. I think he's got a couple of sacks already this year. I can't tell you anything else about the Washington State players, but I am eager to watch them. I've seen Washington play against Rutgers, so I want to see Washington State, because there's usually a couple of interesting local prospects on the Washington State team, and you know they have put one of the more prominent defenders in Deion Buchanan into the league in recent years. So I'll definitely be looking forward to watching that game down the road.
Yeah, and if I can pull up some of the problem maybe with these PFF rankings, and I don't know if it's a problem or not. Well, it's a problem naturally. I mean, it's something that's going to come inherently from college football, which is that there are thousands of these guys.
You know what the biggest problem with PFF is?
What's that?
Is that they gave the Seahawks defense a negative grade against Green Bay. And every now and again, something like that emerges, and it just makes the whole thing seem like an absolute joke.
Yeah, I can't. I'm not quoting their grades for sure, and I'm not. You can't really take those grades with anything, not even a grain of salt. Just toss them to the side, pretend like they don't exist, and trust that. Okay, well, what's going on with this player? Especially because, like I said, there's thousands of these guys. What stood out? Could I look at them and take a deeper look and see if there is something there? Because while the grades are useless in terms of, you know, ranking players or believing the results, I'm still going to be curious what made them think that, and then go look at it deeper. And then with an example of the Seahawks defense, I don't think that we need to look deeper to know that it wasn't a negative performance by the defense. That's a flaw where there's so many things that I think they're not taking into account or understanding or, able to use in their calculations, because of, so many factors. And I mean, the only thing the Seahawks gave up, the Packers ran one play in the red zone, and it was after Russell Wilson's fumble at his own 6-yard line, and they scored on the next play. So that's the only play they were in the red zone all day long.
This is the problem with PFF. There is some value to it, I suppose. I see people often quoting that their offensive line grades are pretty accurate and they match up with the eye test. Obviously, the Seahawks offensive line have been graded very poorly by PFF over the years. But you just, every now and again, you see something and you just go, what? That does not make any sense. The Seahawks defense shut out Aaron Rodgers at Lambeau Field for a whole half. He didn't score a single point. And in the second half, the 2 touchdowns were, like you say, a Russell Wilson fumble at the 5-yard line or something, which led to an immediate touchdown on a running play, which is, it's going to happen. And then the other touchdown was one of Aaron Rodgers, fabled, I'll get you to go offside and then just, lob it downfield as a Hail Mary. And the defenders panic like crazy because if they touch Jordy Nelson in that, it becomes a 40-yard penalty or something, and then it's thrown up. The receivers know what to look for. They're well oiled in terms of knowing what to do when Rodgers gets the flag for offside. So to give the Seahawks defense a negative grade for that, for me, was almost as stupid as the time they gave Aaron Rodgers a negative grade for a 5-touchdown performance against Kansas City.
Yeah. It's it's something that I still struggle sometimes with people posting grades on Reddit or on field goals or Twitter or whatever. Twitter, I'm more forgiving than some places because I'm just like, well, I don't care. Nobody has to listen to anyone on Twitter and nobody has to listen to anyone on, Reddit. But when it gets upvotes and people talk about it and you try and say, well, these grades are arbitrary and they don't have any reasoning and there's no explanation and sometimes it doesn't even make any logical sense. You can get there. It's an unbelievable blind legion of fans leading the charge, maybe because the grade was to the benefit of their player or their team, and it doesn't do anything beyond that. If we were trying to focus on some guys that in college football this year that could be highly drafted in the 2018 NFL draft. If I just throw out a few names here on the CBS Sports NFL mock draft by Chris Trapasso, maybe you could just give me a couple thoughts on if that's reasonable or if you are just have a different kind of grade, but a different grade for these players, a draftable grade. How does that sound?
Sounds good. Let's go for it.
Number one, and this goes exactly to what we were talking about earlier. Number one, Chris Trapasso has Orlando Brown, tackle at Oklahoma. How reasonable or expected is that? Because I know you already sort of touched on what your thoughts are for offensive linemen in the draft next year.
Well, I saw the Oklahoma-Ohio State game. I can't say that I concentrated on their left tackle too much. I have seen some people suggesting that he could be sort of a riser this year and could blossom into something, but he's a player that I want to have a good look at before I pass any comment, really.
Number 3, James Washington, receiver at Oklahoma State.
Yeah, he's played. I watched Mason Rudolph in the opening game. I can't remember who they were playing. It might have been UTEP. And he's got a bit of that. What's the best way to describe him? He's got a bit of that Golden Tate style to him. He's very adept at getting deep, runs good routes. Physical, fast. I don't think that he's going to be a really high pick, but he's one of those players that you could certainly imagine him going in sort of like the middle rounds, a bit like Tyler Lockett, and actually having a decent career.
Number 5, Deion Kane, receiver at Clemson.
Yeah, he's a really good player. Was a player that I highlighted in the summer as someone who could easily take the next step. The Clemson receivers are incredibly well coached. They always are. He's kind of the next one off the production line. Not the biggest guy, he's about 6'2", 6'3", about 195 pounds, but high points to the football. Scored a brilliant touchdown in Clemson's opening weekend victory, where he just beat the guy deep and showed off his speed. Huge touchdown there. He's a playmaker. I don't think we're going to see the best of him this year, because I don't think the Clemson quarterback is quite as good as some of the ones they've had in previous years, and maybe needs a bit more time to develop. But he's a high point machine, so he could easily make some big plays for Clemson. And against Louisville, this will be a big game for him coming up.
Number 8 is a name probably familiar to a lot of fans, Saquon Barkley, running back at Penn State. Last year, we saw Leonard Fournette go number 4, Christian McCaffrey go number 7, and that was bucked the trend of running backs not going high. Do you see Barkley also going in the top 10, and how does the running back class look overall?
Yeah, I think there's every chance that he will go in the top 10. He is the complete package, really, in that he's a tremendous athlete, will run a very fast 40-yard dash. He's perfectly sized. He's got a very similar size and build to Zeke Elliott. He's not the all-round complete back that Elliott was. As a pass protector, he's probably not quite as good, but he makes enough plays in the passing game. Even at the weekend against Pittsburgh, had a really nice touchdown run receiving out the backfield. He can be physically, ran somebody over at the weekend as well on his way to scoring a touchdown. And he's a great character guy, and he lives in the weight room. So I think that if Todd Gurley can go in the top 10 coming off an ACL, Zeke Elliott goes in the top 5. We see these running backs going early every year now. Leonard Fournette, number 4. As you mentioned there, Dalvin Cook would have gone a lot earlier if it wasn't for the character issues. Mm-hmm. I think it's almost a nailed-on certainty that Barkley will go in the top 10 or 12.
And what about Harold Landry, defensive end, Boston College? I feel like we talked about him a lot in the podcast in episodes past. And how do you think you see any really top flight pass rushers in next year's draft?
Well, Landry's kind of undersized. He's not the longest or the biggest. He's a specialist edge rusher. I would say there is perhaps a slight fear that at the next level he might not be quite the difference maker. And, you kind of want to see his physical profile before you sort of really go all in on him. If he runs and performs like Khalil Mack, then that whole Khalil Mack was at Buffalo, and you kind of wanted to. He had some good games too, and had lots of stats. But then when he went to the combine and did what he did, you were like, yeah, okay, he's the real deal. I think Landry would benefit from something similar. There was a bit of a suspicion when a guy doesn't declare and then stays at a team like Boston College, who aren't really competing for anything. Why have they made that decision? Is there a legitimate reason? Is it academics? Is it because they want to get the degree? Is it because they feel very loyal to the team, or is it because they've been given a bit of negative feedback in terms of the draft? Personally, I prefer NC State's Bradley Chubb, who is Nick Chubb's cousin. I just think that he's got the all-round game, can win in many different ways, has got great size and length and speed. And I just think that at the moment he's probably a more accomplished player. And I really wish that Arden Key would get his life sorted so that he could go and play, and we can have a good look at him at LSU as well, because I feel like we're being robbed of a potentially exciting college football player who could be a top 10 pick because of stuff that's nothing to do with football.
Well, yeah, let's spend the rest of the podcast talking about the Seattle Seahawks and the NFL. Let's make sure we have some time for that. And, of course, as everyone listening to this knows, the Seahawks are 0-1 following their 17-9 loss to the Packers in Green Bay at Lambeau Field. The Seahawks only scored 9 points, only had 12 first downs compared to 26 first downs for the Packers, only had 135 net passing yards compared to 286 for the Packers, only rushed for 90 yards, turned the ball over once and forced one turnover. Of course, that turnover that they forced should have been a touchdown, should have changed the outcome of the game in some respects. And so be it. That's a closed book, and we can't go back to it. Now they have to prepare for the San Francisco 49ers. And Rob, if I asked you what's your biggest concern, I would be wasting our time. So rather than ask you what your biggest concern is, I would ask, do you see any changes that need to be made immediately to the offensive line, or do you think that you have to stick with this for another few games and give them time to gel? Or is there any sort of switching around where you're like, well, I just don't see how this player or this position is going to improve with more time?
I don't think there's anything to be gained from swapping people around or bringing different people in. I mean, what's going to be really the difference? You know, I've seen people suggesting put Luke Jokel at left tackle. Well, you know, he didn't look that great at left guard, and left tackle's a harder position. So, you know, I don't really see the benefit there. I saw a suggestion of moving Justin Britt. You know, you've just spent 3 years trying to find out what Justin Britt is. You find out he's one of the best centres in the league, and then you're going to move him away from the centre position. I think that Ifedi played fairly well. I suppose the only one change you could possibly suggest is Ode Ibushi coming in for Mark Lewinsky, who just continues to not be particularly impressive. I've seen some quotes from Tom Cable in the last few moments saying that they're going to stick with the same starters, and I think that's completely understandable. Look, there's been a lot of criticism of Tom Cable, and as we talked earlier, and a lot of talk about why doesn't he develop these offensive lines. I just want to sort of spend a couple of moments, Kenny, and your thoughts on this. So reflecting on what he's had to do. From 2013, he's had to replace every single starter on that offensive line. I suspect if Tom Cable hopped in the podcast with us now, Kenny, and had taken a dose of truth serum, that if it was up to him, they probably would have retained some of those five, whether it was James Carpenter, whether it was J.R. Sweezy, Okung, Giacomini, Unger. I'm guessing that in his ideal world, you know, completely blowing up the offensive line and starting again without sort of the top 10 draft picks that they had to spend on people like Russell Okung probably wasn't what he wanted to do, if he was honest, as an offensive lineman. He's been tasked to do that. And as we've reflected on the options for the Seahawks, I think they've passed on 4 Pro Bowl offensive linemen in the whole time that Carroll has been here since 2010. You know, there's not a cluster of players going from the end of first round to the 7th round and undrafted free agency who have gone on to have fantastic careers in the NFL. You know, the best offensive linemen in the NFL right now are people like Zach Martin, Tyrone Smith, who are top 20 picks. You know, the Pounceys, people like that over the years. Conklin and you know all the names. You know, people don't need me to spell them out. Players that the Seahawks have not had any opportunity to draft. He's had to turn a defensive lineman into a guard, which he did with J.R. Sweezy. He's had to turn a basketball player into a left tackle, which he was doing until Fant got injured. We'll never know how good he was going to be this year. He's had to turn Justin Britt from a tackle to a guard to a center. You know, he's had to do an awful lot. And then this year, you know, he lost the starting left tackle in preseason and has had to put another guy in there. You know, there aren't many teams starting a backup left tackle who are going to have a lot of success at that position in the NFL. So there's a lot going on there. That's not to sort of completely excuse the performance. It wasn't good enough, but let's have a bit of perspective on what is going on here. And I think that you will find there's a lot of teams in the league. Cincinnati's offensive line is an absolute joke. They've spent first, second round picks, you know, Fisher at Oregon and Abui from Texas A&M. They've spent first round picks in their offensive line. Their offensive line's a joke. The New York Giants have got Eric Flowers. They've got Justin Pugh. They've the center, I think, was a second-round pick. Their offensive line is a joke. The Houston Texans gave up, what was it, something like 10 sacks against Jacksonville at the weekend. Their offensive line's a joke. You could sort of run through the league. Dallas, Oakland, Tennessee, you know, these teams are the exception to the rule. Most teams have bad offensive lines, and the ones who have been able to plug in free agents on $10 million contracts, good for them. The Seahawks are not in that kind of a position. What the Seahawks need to do better, to answer your question, is find a way to live around this. And I don't think asking Eddie Lacy to run into a 9-man front, which is what he was doing against Green Bay, where you've got 5 offensive linemen, maybe a tight end in to help and a running back against 8 or 9 players for Green Bay, and asking him to run in there and create, he was just running into a brick wall, you know, and that's not going to work. Max protect and having 2 receivers or 1 receiver and Jimmy Graham just run into the secondary where they could sort of leave 2 or 3 players in there and then trying to ask Russell Wilson to throw the world's perfect pass in order to get a long downfield completion isn't going to work. They need to come up with a scheme which will take some of the pressure off Wilson, which will take some of the pressure off the offensive line. I'm not going to sit here and be Monday morning offensive coordinator or try and suggest that I've got all the answers, whether that's more of a spread system, whether that's putting Wilson in the gun, whether that's having running backs sort of on checkdowns for him fairly often, whether that's, using the tight ends differently, whether that's just going to a much more up-tempo system, whether that's using the pass to set up the run, I don't know. But they have to do one thing they have to do is try and take players out of the box to create running lanes so they can actually run the ball. And two, they've got to find a way to get the ball out quickly and get some confidence into that offensive line, get some confidence into Russell Wilson to work behind that offensive line. There are plenty of teams out there with bad offensive lines that game plan around that to try and minimize it as an issue. And one thing Seattle didn't do against Green Bay was game plan around their offensive line. They got their asses kicked and they didn't have any answers to that.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing too is, I mean, a tweet I sent out earlier today, which was just talking about the experience level that these players have on this team at these positions, and I think because I saw someone send out something where it said like, look, Reese Adiambo, 3rd round pick. Luke Jokel, 1st round pick. Justin Britt, 2nd round pick. Mark Lewinsky, 4th round pick. Jermaine Ifedi, 1st round pick. And when you put it that way, it sure tricks people, I think, into thinking that there has been a ton of invested and that these players, because of their draft position, should be considered really good at this point. If you're a 1st round pick or you're a 3rd round pick, like, don't tell me that the Seahawks didn't put in a ton of draft capital in their offensive line, because they have. And Green Bay didn't, because Green Bay has a lot of players that maybe were underdrafted. Well, first of all, if you read the article that John Gilbert wrote for Field Goals, you'll see that Tom Cable has gotten more than expected out of his offensive linemen based on their draft position, and that's pretty much indisputable. And second of all, being a 1st round pick is a totally different thing if you're in the top 5 or if you're in the bottom 5, if you're in that 28, 27 range. Jermaine Ifedi, 31st overall pick is not the same as a guy drafted 2nd overall, and it's not even close. One of those guys should go on to be an all-pro, and one of those guys should be able to handle the job. And that's about, that he should be a starter, because that's how big of a gap, especially as you've already pointed out, that's how big of a gap that you get into those late 1st round offensive linemen in 2017. That's not very many talented offensive linemen coming out of college football. And if there are, they're going to go before the Seahawks are picking, because the Seahawks are a good team. That's the problem that they had with guys like not being able to get a chance at Garrett Bowles. That's the thing that's going to happen if you're not going to get a shot at a Jack Conklin. They don't have shots at these players, and you can't compare Jermaine Ifedi or Justin Britt. You can't compare a late 2nd round pick to someone who's drafted even at the top of the 2nd round. Now at that point, you're talking about, getting guys that are now maybe talented, but need a lot, like physically talented, but need a lot of work. And that's where they go, is that now you're talking about guys that maybe either have a lot of talent, but need a lot of refining, or were very good in college, but have very little physical tools to work with. And then you have to find the balance. But these are not high draft picks. A 3rd round pick. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about it. Reese Adiambo, a 3rd round pick 1 year ago, had not had any very much meaningful play time as a rookie and wasn't at left tackle. So this is Reese Adiambo's 1st career start, period. Luke Jokel, yes, he was the 2nd overall pick, and he was a disappointment for a 2nd overall pick. So I don't know what all of a sudden we're now putting the onus for Luke Jokel's career disappointment on Tom Cable, a guy that he started working with in August. I don't understand how we're supposed to start doing that. So forget him. And by the way, his 1st start at left guard for the Seahawks and his 5th start at left guard ever. He has not been a left guard at any point in his career until last year with the Jacksonville Jaguars, including at Texas A&M. And so this is his 2nd time playing guard, 2nd team playing guard, but 5th time ever starting at left guard. And it's been almost a year since he last did it. Justin Britt, his 18th career start at center at any age, at any point in his career, his 18th start at center, Mark Lewinsky, it was his second start at right guard. I put first start at right guard because I forgot about one last year. So that's 2 starts at right guard for Mark Lewinsky ever in the NFL. And Jermaine Ifedi, his first start at right tackle after spending all of last year at right guard. So in total, going into this game, the Seahawks starting offensive line had 18 career starts for the Seahawks at that position. So as much as it feels like, well, look, you're bringing back Britt and Glowinski and Ifedi, so they should start to have chemistry together. And Luke Jokel was the second overall pick. And, I don't know what we're supposed to expect out of Risa Yambo. But there is, and people would say, well, what's the big deal? You're an offensive lineman. Who cares what position you play? And that's a bad point. It shows that you don't know much about how football works or offensive lineman works. You are relying so heavily on the guy to your left and the guy to your right. You've got to be as close to them as you're close with your significant other, and you got to understand where they're moving. And we saw some ugly situations against the Green Bay Packers where it was clear there was no chemistry and there was no communication between the guy to his left and the guy to his right. And that's where players like Mac Daniels, who could be an all-pro this year, were able to easily take advantage of these guys who maybe don't have that trust of the dudes that are standing on either side of them. And so the Seahawks offensive line, and fire Tom Cable and all this stuff, yes, it is a problem. The Seahawks offensive line is a problem. No, there's not a way to fix it probably at this point. And C, I don't know how they were supposed to fix it in the offseason without making a lot of changes. Everybody wanted them to sign TJ Lang and spend a bunch of money on it and trade up or something for offensive linemen and do a bunch of things that weren't possible. But those would have all involved making big changes. And if you want to see a problem, I think go look at the Minnesota Vikings, the Carolina Panthers, the LA Chargers, and the Denver Broncos, who spent a ton of money and spent a bunch of capital on changing their offensive lines. And I wouldn't be surprised one bit if by the end of the year, all 5 of these teams have a mess at offensive line, because as Rob, you've pointed out many times, there's just an offensive line problem in the NFL, period.
Yeah, there is. And look, people can make a case that they'd be better off spending Jimmy Graham's $10 million a year on an offensive lineman instead of paying him. But it's all relative. When the Seahawks traded for Jimmy Graham, no one was saying that's a bad trade or, we don't want Jimmy Graham. There was just a lot of excitement there. The problem is the way that the Seahawks use Jimmy Graham. I mean, Jimmy Graham could be the perfect answer to take some of the pressure off the offensive line. For some reason, the Seahawks seem really determined to use him as this kind of like wide tight end. His blocking is still poor. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it, Kenny. People will have seen this. There are clips from the All-22 tape that are on social media where there was one play where I think it was Nick Perry rushed from the edge and Graham was positioned next to Risa Yambo and was expected to chip Perry and then run out into the flat as a check down option. Graham's body language was just like, no, I don't really fancy doing the chip. He kind of just sort of stood there. Odiambo was expecting Graham to help, so positioned his body, was kind of off balance as a consequence of this. And Nick Perry just dumped Odiambo on his backside. And I don't know whether he sacked Wilson or hit Wilson, but, it was a play that was blown up because of Jimmy Graham. And that's why Pete Carroll said that he had a bad game this week. And I just think the Seahawks have to do a better job of sort of scheming to their talent. How they have the players in Baldwin and Graham and some very good pass catching running backs and some other weapons on their team, people like Lockett and Richardson, who can take some of the pressure off this offensive line. But they have to do it. They can't be stubborn and say, okay, we want to run the ball. We want to do this. We want to do that. We're going to do it regardless of what the matchup is or the situation. And then look at a 9-man front and think, well, the solution to this is to run, one pace steady Lacy right at this line and then expect success. None of this is to say that the offensive linemen played well against Green Bay. They didn't. I just think that some of the immediate foaming at the mouth, fire Tom Cable reaction that you get every time the offensive line has a bad day is it sort of ignores the bigger picture. And there are so many strands to this, whether it's the changing of the line, the college football problem, the fact that they've lost fan, the way that the Seahawks have game planned and schemed around these situations. I just think this all comes down to them finding a rhythm and something that works for them in the way that they did in 2015. because they're no longer the Marshawn Lynch Seahawks. Teams are not scared to death of Marshawn Lynch. Marshawn Lynch used to go out there, run for as little as 50 or 60 yards sometimes, and would still have a massive impact on the game because he'd wear down a defense. They'd be keyed in on him. They'd have to constantly be aware of what Marshawn Lynch was doing on the field. They don't have that anymore. Teams are not looking at Lacey and Carson and Procise and Thomas Rawls when he's healthy again and having that same feeling. They have to find what works for them and their personnel this year, because the Seahawks only need an average offense with the way the defense is playing to have a very, very good year, but they have to get there. I don't think they can force this anymore.
Let's rapid fire some of these new players before, quickly getting into the 49ers and wrapping up. But rapid fire some of the new guys and just talk. Rob, you gave your quick thoughts on how they looked in their first game with the Seahawks. Chris Carson.
Well, he looked fairly good. I mean, he had the most of the snaps at the running back position. There was that one sort of cut back where he found some space and broke off a good run. He had one catch that was good. The thing that he does that Lacey doesn't do is that if he hits the line, there's a chance that it'll be a 2-yard gain instead of a 2-yard loss or no gain. So I think for me, on that evidence, Eddie Lacey really needs to step up his game, and they've got to find a way to make him useful. Otherwise, there's very little argument not to make. Rawls and Carson, the sort of the top two with Procise having a role there. And you even wonder whether or not they'd be better off with Mike Davis on the roster instead of Eddie Lacey if this is the way that they're going to use him and the way that he's going to play. So I certainly think Carson just continues to strengthen his position, and who knows, by the end of the year, he could be the lead running back.
Shaquille Griffin.
Thought he played fairly well. I think there's maybe been a little bit too much made of his performance in that he didn't get beat deep, which is great. That's fine. That's good. Let's hope that never happens. But if he has got sort of a way to go to take the next step. There were a couple of issues in coverage. I think that I read somewhere that someone broke down. There was a play when Green Bay had something like a 3rd and 17, I think it was, and they got 21 yards, and he sort of whiffed in his coverage on Devontae Adams. So, there are still things to work out, but having to come into the game in that situation and Jeremy Lane getting ejected the way that he did, I think you have to sort of doff your cap a little bit to Shaquille Griffin and say, given the circumstances against Aaron Rodgers, the fact that he didn't give up an insane, massive, game-changing plays, to his credit, and let's hope that he can continue to go from strength to strength.
Nazir Jones and Sheldon Richardson.
Well, Sheldon Richardson played, he had a quiet first half. In the second half, he drew the 2 holding penalties. They seem to be working him in slowly, and he seemed to play a lot more 1 technique than 3 technique at the weekend, and had a job to do as opposed to just being like, hair on fire pass rusher. So we'll see if his role develops over the next few weeks. Nos Jones, doesn't get much better than your first snap being an interception. I know there's been lots of different opinions on this, but for me, that should have been a touchdown. I think if you're going to call a block in the back on a pick 6 like that, it has to be absolutely mind-blowingly impactful. And what Cliff Averill did not impact that being a touchdown or not. And the Jeremy Lane ejection thing was just a load of BS. I don't know why you don't just get the 2 guys together and say, listen, any more stuff like that, and we're going to start ejecting people. You just use a bit of common sense. It's not like Jeremy Lane had been involved in several incidents before that. He drew a penalty because of some taunting from Randall Cobb, and then the next play he was yanked down by his face mask, retaliated and was ejected. I think that was a load of BS, like I said. So that should have been a touchdown, and if it had been a touchdown, who knows what would have happened in that game.
I don't know if you were able to recognize much off of these players, but not a lot has been said, but some has been said. But Justin Coleman had 41 snaps. Terrence Garvin had 31 snaps and a sack. Any thoughts on those two?
Yeah, I thought Garvin sort of had hit and miss plays. From what I could tell, there was a couple of moments where I think he failed in contain, sort of some coverage responsibilities that he messed up a little bit on. So those are the negatives, but he did have the sack. He was flying around a lot as well. I think he's going to be the kind of player that's going to be an upgrade on Mike Morgan and Cassius Marsh that they had last year. But at the same time, he's not going to be, he's not going to be Bruce Irvin as a pass rusher, and he's not going to be, really, he's not going to another Wagner and Wright. So I think that for what he is, I think he's going to do a decent job this year.
So yeah, we'll see how they do in week 2, against the San Francisco 49ers at home. A good chance for the Seahawks, a good opportunity, I should say, for the Seahawks to get back to 1-1, not get back to, but get to 1-1, get their first win of the season against the 49ers, who lost 23-3 in Kyle Shanahan's first game as head coach. And when they were at home against the Carolina Panthers, they didn't get any offensive going, 51 rushing yards, 2 turnovers, 166 passing yards in going up against Carolina with Brian Hoyer and Carlos Hyde and Pierre Garçon and some of the players that we'll see there. And maybe the biggest concern, of course, being DeForest Buckner and Solomon Thomas and Noah Bowman and that front seven that isn't untalented for San Francisco, though certainly overall the team, the 49ers, do look like they should be one of the worst in the NFL. And man, looking at their schedule, 4 of their first 6 games, or 4 of their first 6 games being on the road at Seattle, then they come home against the Rams, then at Arizona. So they'll know a lot about their NFC West standings in the next 3 weeks, and then at Indianapolis, at Washington. In terms of facing off against the San Francisco 49ers, what would you like to see, and what would you expect to see?
Well, I expect to see a Seahawks win, and a comfortable win at that. There's very little about the 49ers right now to be fearful of. Brian Hoyer at quarterback, not many weapons on offense. A new head coach who's still trying to create an identity there. Defensively, they have some players on the D line, but Reuben Foster's not going to be healthy for this game. He's got a high ankle sprain, so I would expect the Seahawks to win comfortably. I don't think we're going to learn an awful lot from this game. I think the Tennessee game is going to be the next big test of what this team is and what they could be this year. They can't go on the road and have games like they did in Green Bay and last year, like they had against Tampa Bay, for example. They have to move on from this very quickly and just sort of treat that as a week 1 blemish. So the Tennessee game is going to be very interesting to see what the Seahawks are. I mean, the benefits that you can get from a game like this is 1, don't have any injuries, 2, get the running game going, 3, get some confidence into that offensive line. If you can do those 3 things, and you can actually get some tangible benefit to take into that Tennessee game. But from fans' points of view, and whether they're going to quell some of the concern about the O-line and the offense and stuff like that, it doesn't. They could put up 40 points in this game. I don't think people will say it's the 49ers. It's one of those. The Seahawks can't really win in terms of reactions to this game. If the Seahawks absolutely give the 49ers a grand pasting in this game, people will say it's the 49ers. If the Seahawks struggle or even lose the game, then people will say, how can you lose to the 49ers or struggle against this 49ers team? So there's very little that they can win in this one, but they can get some confidence into the team, and let's hope they get a nice, strong, solid performance. Maybe even score some red zone touchdowns. That'd be nice to see, and can avoid any sort of big injuries and big sacks and stuff like that. Get out of this game healthy and move on.
Absolutely. And it'd be nice to see, just a second game for a lot of these guys. And hopefully, what's nice about week 1 is that for the most part, it may be your healthiest game of the year. The Seahawks did manage to come out pretty healthy. But what's hard about it is when you have new guys and when you're trying to work certain new wrinkles in, Bradley McDougald was 1 snap on defense. He's not a part of the team right now other than special teams. There are things that you want to see how they get caught up to speed. And the Seahawks under Pete Carroll have historically been a second half team, not just in games, but in the year. And if they can get into the break at 5-3, there's a good chance that they're the type of team that could run the table, at the very least go 7-1 in the second half of the year. So you just want to see them get it out as many wins early in the year as possible, because certainly the offensive, more than anything, when those number 1 DVOA finishes that the Seahawks had for those 4 years in a row, it all came down to second half runs. And that's what we're hoping for, not just hoping for in second half runs, but we're hoping to get it going a little earlier. That's what happened in 2013 when they won the Super Bowl, was they were good all year long. And it's okay to have a week 1 stumble, but to come back against San Francisco and show what you can really do and have a week 2 that doesn't have any struggles. It also doesn't, on that note, doesn't guarantee that the Seahawks are going to be as good as we'd like them to be this year, but it would be a nice feeling for them to have success against San Francisco's front seven, get the ball moving, not just through the air, but also through the ground, find some identity on offense, and the defense itself just continue to have those dominant performances, which I think that they can, and allowing 17 points to Green Bay at Lambeau Field, when 7 of those points came off of a fumble by Russell Wilson at the 6, and because of the offensive line, when you talk about how much Green Bay actually got done on offense at home with Aaron Rodgers, very encouraging. And if they can do that to Rodgers in Green Bay, what can they do with Brian Hoyer in Seattle? That'll be a big key to the game. Follow Rob Twitter. Guys, my name's Kenneth Arthur, and I screw up a lot. So follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten. Go to SeahawksDraftLog.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes by subscribing to Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, where sometimes it'll be a Seaside Chat, and sometimes it'll be 3000 NFL Mock Draft, and sometimes it'll be a combination of the two. And you can follow me on Twitter at Kenneth Arthur S or at Field Goals. Go to fieldgoals.com. If you have any questions, write your local congressman, unless you're in the UK, where I don't know how politics work. So that's it for this week on 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Thanks for listening, and come back next time for a brand new draft.